Hi, everybody. This second lecture contextualizes Frankenstein in science and natural philosophy, that which is the precursor to modern-day science. I also want you to learn about or review primary and secondary sources and the differences between them, and also the different kinds of secondary sources. We're going to be looking at scholarly sources and popular criticism this week, so I want you to know the difference. We're also going to be looking at key terms for the week that include scholarly article, scholar or critic, literature review, citation, critical agreement or disagreement, popular criticism, as I said before, and learned how to do a little bit of annotation. We're going to reflect on and synthesize the literary and historical movements that we've learned about so far, particularly industrialization, Enlightenment, and Romanticism, and also to learn about the key themes for the week's reading: alchemy versus natural philosophy, vitalism versus materialism, Galvanism, and very exciting, the search for the secret of life. And the debate in Frankenstein and surrounding Frankenstein was natural procreation versus electrical regeneration. Before we begin to look more deeply at some of the movements and scientific findings that inspired Frankenstein, it's important to go over some of the terminology about what kinds of sources we'll be looking at this whole semester. As a novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a primary source. That just means that it is the object of study. Literary scholars write articles about and critical introductions to it, and students like you write papers analyzing its key themes, structure, and literary features. Those articles, critical introductions, and student papers, as well as most of the videos we're going to be watching in this class, are secondary sources because they analyze the primary source, in this case Frankenstein. On the slide here, I put pictures of the 1818 text from which I took the scholarly article that we're going to be reading this week. Notice that on the right side of the page in the contents that I reproduced here, I marked out the primary source, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, that starts on page 47 and goes for just under 200 pages, followed by the appendices. Appendix A, The Education of Mary Shelley, Godwin, and Wollstonecraft. That's an article. Another article that we'll be reading is Appendix B, The Education of Victor Frankenstein, Darwin, and Davy, etc. All of these articles are considered secondary sources. The Education of Victor Frankenstein, Darwin, and Davy is an excerpt from this critical introduction written by the edition's editors, the literary scholars D.L. MacDonald and Kathleen Scharf, who are both professors and experts in English fiction from the 18th and early 19th centuries. While it's not truly what we would call a scholarly article, which is normally a longer piece that makes a stronger argument than this short introduction section and is published in a peer-reviewed journal, it still adheres to the general requirements of scholarly writing. Specifically, it is considered a work of scholarly criticism because it cites the work of a number of other literary scholars who have written about the same topic. In this case, the use of scientific ideas that were circulating around Europe and the United States when Shelley was writing Frankenstein. In fact, it does not just cite them, but it compares and contrasts different sources in a rigorous and systematic way to reveal critical agreement and disagreement. This happens throughout the article, but primarily on pages 18 and 19, which we'll look at a bit later in the slideshow. This section is called the literature review, a term that is also used in science publishing, in which the author presents or reviews, in the sense of listing, the ideas that have already been published on the topic. You might think of this as going over a scholarly conversation that's already going on. This idea may be familiar to you if you've studied the book They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing in English 101, which I know several of you have. The article then synthesizes the ideas written by others to produce its own argument. In contrast, the video that I put into Module 2 for extra credit, Vox History Club's The Real Experiments That Inspired Frankenstein, is a popular source. It is created by Phil Edwards and Coleman Lowndes, journalists who are interested in science writing but who do not specialize in any particular time period or authors. You will notice that the video intersperses and splices together a lot of clips from popular culture, including Hollywood films, paintings, drawings, illustrations, and historical documents to help Edwards and Lowndes tell a story about galvanism, but it only lists those sources at the very end, whereas in the scholarly article you have page numbers, you have footnotes. While scholarly articles can be rewarding in their own way, popular articles and videos are designed to be entertaining as well as informative. However, popular sources are not held to the same standards of citation as scholarly articles. All of those images that are included in the video are credited at the end, as I said, for legal reasons, but not with the same level of attention or centrality that scholarly sources afford to clearly labeling where information or documents can be found. This is not to say that popular sources are in any way less important or less good than scholarly sources. They're just different, and they're intended for very different audiences. Scholarly sources are written for an academic audience to inform and add to a professional dialogue about a subject, whereas popular sources are written for non-specialist audiences to entertain, to inform, and also for the magazine or newspaper or website to sell advertising. For these reasons, there's a lot more popular writing out there than scholarly. Scholarly writing takes a huge amount of time and attention to detail, and at least in the case of journal articles, it's not compensated work. On the other hand, popular writing is done by professional journalists who often work with a whole research and technology team that may even include scholars to help them put together content more quickly. Journalists' individual projects are also compensated financially, while scholars are usually employed at universities, and writing scholarly work for outside sources is considered part of their job. Depending on what you're writing for your classes, you may or may not be allowed to use popular sources in your papers. In my classes, you are. You just have to be reliable. You have to be using reliable sources, which is another topic altogether that we'll cover when we talk about the research paper. Scholarly authors, as a rule, do not cite popular sources in their scholarly work, but popular writers do often cite scholarly work. We're now going to move on to the literary and historical movements that helped shape Frankenstein, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and industrialization. We're going to begin with the Enlightenment. This philosophical and artistic movement of the 18th century in Europe and the Americas is characterized by two very radical ideas. The first is that God and nature are one, an idea that stuck for the Romantics as well, and second, that humans are good by nature, but then they're corrupted by society. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in The Social Contract, a key Enlightenment text, that, quote, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." Enlightenment thinkers privileged the idea that maturity means thinking and reasoning on your own, and synthesized the rationalist ideas of Descartes. He wrote, "I think, therefore I am," with empiricism, the idea that we can only know that which we can measure materially, and also who believed that humans are born blank slates which are filled out as they grow up. The Enlightenment saw, of course, the birth of modern science, and also the spirit of political revolution against tyranny and colonialism in what would become the United States, Haiti, and large parts of Latin America, as well as the French Revolution. The increased interest in science in the Enlightenment period led eventually to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, or the First Industrial Revolution, we should say, started in approximately 1760 in England, and later spread to other parts of Europe and the US. It changed the way that goods, particularly clothing items, were manufactured. Instead of skilled artisans making items by hand, for example, spinning yarn, weaving fabric, design, and sewing of clothes, the industry slowly transitioned over to machines doing most of the work, while unskilled workers oversaw and took care of the machines and cleaned and maintained the factory. On the one hand, cheap, fast production of hundreds of times more products allowed for more people to access more consumer goods, which in turn improved standards of living and hygiene for a lot of people. But on the other hand, working conditions in factories became increasingly more and more precarious and dangerous, especially for the many children employed there. Cities became increasingly populated as people moved from the country to work in these new factories, and the factories were extremely polluting for these growing cities. There was also a sense of loss for many people who feared that machines would soon take over all different kinds of jobs and make more and more kinds of labor unskilled. Does this sound familiar? People also felt nostalgic for the idea of a simpler, more natural life, away from the bustle and population of the new growing cities. Disappointed with the Industrial Revolution, with the pollution of cities, and with the turn away from nature, Romanticism, not to be confused with romance, which is a totally different genre, or romantic comedies, for example. Romanticism, it was an artistic period developed at the end of the 18th century and is marked by an emphasis on emotional rather than rational experience. Romantic literature and art strove to break away from the rationalism of the Enlightenment. This is evidenced foremost in this painting, Saturn Devouring His Son, by the Spanish painter Francisco Goya on the left. This is a horrifying rendering of the myth of the Roman god Saturn, who, fearing a prophecy that he would be overthrown by one of his own children, swallows each in turn, except for Jupiter, who's replaced by a stone by his mother. Goya's terrifying cannibalistic depiction of a frenzied creature devouring what actually appears to be a woman is one of the most famous paintings of the Romantic era. It shows unbridled emotion, frenzy, craziness, not rational. The art is not natural, is not realistic, right? It can be distorted, impressionistic, and often incorporates supernatural elements, horror, or this idea of the uncanny, something that feels really unfamiliar. Other proponents of Romanticism desired to get back to nature and away from the cities that were growing due to the Industrial Revolution. So natural themes are very popular in this period. We can see this in the painting on the right, the English painter W.J.M. Turner's watercolor Sea View. Much of Turner's work juxtaposes his fascination with the power of nature and humans' desire to find a place in it, or even to dominate it. You can see this in the contrast between the clouds and the sea and the sailboats that you can see in the bottom part of the picture, which are a bit distorted. Similarly to Saturn Devouring His Son, Turner does not use really realistic photographic elements in his paintings. This is not because one couldn't. If you look back a few slides at the painting of the two scientists, that was extremely detailed and realistic looking. Turner chooses to make his work more abstracted to convey an emotional element. Different genres appeared during this period, mostly inspired by the adventures of the Middle Ages rather than the classicism of Greek and Roman literature, even though some of the subjects remain the same. Romantic literature is often inspired by fairy tales. In fact, this is when a lot of the fairy tales that we know today were written, like those of the Brothers Grimm. And also they were influenced by folk tales and ghost stories. Gothic literature is a romantic form, for example. Magic and the uncanny are often represented in romantic literature. We're now going to move on to the scholarly source that I provided you to read for this week, The Education of Victor Frankenstein, Darwin, and Davy by MacDonald and Scherf. I want you to print out or at least download the scholarly secondary article and to add notes to it. It's called annotation. I suggest that as you read the text, you think about what each page does, thinking about it page by page. I'm going to go through it with you now, showing you my annotations, or a few of my annotations, to give you some inspiration of what to look for. I want you to mark out and take notes on the following as well on your own copy of the text, as well as anything else that interests you. Notice how the literature review on pages 18 to 19 compares and contrasts different ways in which Frankenstein's use of science has been interpreted by various scholars. Note in particular the language that's used to describe a critical agreement or disagreement. I underline the sentence, Samuel Holmes' Fassbinder demonstrates clearly that the novel contrasts modern science to sorcery and alchemy rather than identifying it with them, as critics like Rieger had assumed. So notice that wrapped up in this one sentence here are two different critical opinions that contrast. The critic Rieger believes that Shelley saw science and sorcery, alchemy as the same thing, whereas Fassbinder demonstrates MacDonald and Scherf write clearly that the, quote, the novel contrasts modern science to sorcery and alchemy, so it does not see them as the same. It seems as though MacDonald and Scherf agree with Fassbinder here, just based on the way that it's written. By the way, alchemy is the pseudoscientific attempt to turn base metals into gold, but also witchcraft more generally. think Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's or Philosopher's Stone, the Elixir of Life, etc. Another example, Anne K. Mellor, who is a critic that's very often cited. She's really a classic Shelley scholar who is cited in almost every article about Frankenstein, contrasts the, quote, aggressive masculinist science of Sir Humphrey Davy and the non-interventionist ecologically sensitive science of Erasmus Darwin. While other authors of this article claim that Darwin and Davy were actually more similar than Mellor allows, and that Shelley used both of their ideas when writing Frankenstein. On this page, we also have a little bit about the critic Marilyn Butler, who contrasts vitalism with materialism, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So remember, this is all called a literature review. It's reviewing what has been said previously about Frankenstein in terms of science. As you've read in Shelley's novel, Victor Frankenstein is obsessed with discovering what is the spark of life. Page 19 of MacDonald and Scherff contextualizes the arguments that natural philosophers were having about what constituted life into Shelley's ideas and the fragments of texts that may document what she, her husband, and their friends thought was the, quote, nature of the principle of life. We learn here that Shelley incorporated all different kinds of scientific ideas and debates: vitalism versus materialism, alchemy versus natural philosophy, which is the principle that would become modern science again, and then galvanism versus procreation. And she put all of these into her novel, in fact, not just one specific theory. MacDonald and Scherff are careful to distinguish two really important ideas in natural philosophy during this time period, during Shelley's lifetime. The idea of vitalism, which is this philosophy that there is some kind of life force, nothing physical like blood, but rather a spiritual or energetic substance that may one day be discovered that concerns the spark of life. And electricity was considered a possible candidate for this life force. So they contrast vitalism with materialist biology, which is still the principle that drives biology today, and that is that biology and life is simply the totality of an organism's functions. That's a quotation from page 18. On pages 20 and 21, MacDonald and Scherff introduce us to Erasmus Darwin. This is the grandfather of Charles Darwin. His poetry has as its central philosophy the idea of vitalism. And on page 21, the authors point out that Darwin's poetry is cited in Shelley's 1831 preface to Frankenstein. They discuss how she incorporated Darwin's ideas about spontaneous generation, that is, using electricity to try to reanimate dead animals or body parts, into the novel. They point out, however, that, this is the part that I highlighted on in the slide, that Darwin would have not approved of Victor's experiments, that they would be, quote, unnatural. Quote, in avoiding sexual reproduction, Victor is not simply descending some abstract biological hierarchy, but committing a serious offense, end quote. That's from page 22. Some may try to draw connections between debates about fertility today, for example, in terms of IVF. So it was only, for example, in 2019 that France passed a law that national health care would cover fertility treatments for single women and women in non-heterosexual relationships. And there was a huge backlash against this from conservative groups. I don't think that that's really a valid comparison, however. I think a more valid comparison between Frankenstein and real science today is perhaps the debate about cloning. In any case, even though Shelley incorporated Darwin's ideas into her novel, it's not 100% reproducing these ideas. Darwin would have been quite critical of Frankenstein. On page 22, the authors introduce us to the other main scientist considered in this article, Sir Humphrey Davy. Davy is really famous, actually, for discovering potassium, sodium, magnesium, calcium, boron, barium, and strontium. So he was a really influential natural philosopher of his day. Like Erasmus Darwin, he was also a friend of the Wollstonecraft-Godwin family. Davy's writing is also a huge influence for the character Frankenstein, in that his ideas tend more toward a desire to master and overcome nature. Davy, quote, spoke intriguingly of the conversion of dead matter into living matter and of producing from combinations of dead matter effects that were formerly occasioned only by animal organs. He also dared to call science almost, quote, creative, a word which still had powerful religious connotations in this Romantic period and which would have really angered religious leaders. Nevertheless, in the end, Victor and Davy are shown to be more dissimilar than similar, in that Davy at least understood that Victor's obsessiveness is destructive. And Shelley, I highlighted a couple of points in the slide here from page 24, that Shelley uses the real scientist, Davy, to criticize Victor, for Davy warns against the presumptions of speculative philosophers, once again using sexual imagery, just like Erasmus Darwin did. And moreover, his insistence that the study of science should give, quote, give a permanent and placid enjoyment to the mind and even destroy diseases of the imagination, which is evocative of Victor's obsessiveness, this idea of a disease, that his singular monomania about discovering the spark of life has become a disease of his imagination. Another important theory that we haven't talked about yet is galvanism. In 1791, the Italian natural philosopher Luigi Galvani rigged up a lightning rod and a dead frog in his garden, and he waited for a storm. According to Andrew Lai, writing in Helix magazine, Galvani's experiments on reanimating animal body parts with electrical currents, while flawed, did end up moving science forward. Quote, with animal electricity theory, scientists were able to verify their scientific hypotheses using electrical equipment. Armed with this new way to think about movement, the study of human physiology became increasingly grounded in physics and less grounded in mystical beliefs. So even though MacDonald and Scherf say that Galvani was a little bit too cautious to make any grand claims about electricity as a vital principle, again, vital is in this idea of some kind of energetic life force that runs through us, that makes us alive. Nevertheless, Galvani's ideas actually brought it closer to what today we would consider scientific rather than pseudoscience. And here you can see from Helix magazine the recreation of the original print from Galvani's publication, an illustration of his setup depicting the dead frog on the table connected to the lightning rod. Thank you for listening to this lecture on Victor's relationship to science. I hope that it's serving as a good primer for how to distinguish as well between primary and secondary sources and between the different kinds of secondary sources. I hope you found it interesting and that will help you understand the novel better. Also, don't forget to watch the Vox video on galvanism, and have a great week.